of my favorite cities in this part of the Europe. So thank you again, Sofia platform, for the invitation. Following up our meeting in Berlin, I will try to keep up with such a distinguished panel. When I was reading who is going to join us this afternoon, I was yet again thinking, how could I be actually the first one to take the empty seat and ask questions to our panelists. I don't want to give you a very long introduction. I just want to say that we will try to connect our speakers and their ideas with the findings of the report, and I'm sure that there are still copies of the report in the room for those of you who did not have the time to go through it thoroughly. So without further ado, and given the fact that you already have the bios of our panelists with you, I'd like to start and remind everyone that we will try to have some opening remarks of around 5 to 7 minutes, and then opening up to as many of the distinguished colleagues in the room. So just a reminder, as Lisa already said, we are hoping that as much as you will join us, and I will actually also want to thank our colleague for the opening remarks, and actually try to continue the conversation by linking it with the report. And probably my opening question would be trying to pick up on one of the, so to say, warnings of the introduction in the report, saying that was mentioning actually that it tries as much as possible to go into drawing some of the potential lines, some of the main ideas that unite us across the region when it comes to this generation of transition, should we agree that there is one. But to the same extent, one of the strengths, in my opinion, of this amazing effort, both in research and regional reach, is the nuances. So what are those nuances on which we could pick up based on our local context that would actually give us a better understanding of where we are heading? The report quotes Havel's civility and the need to support Havel's civility of the person, of the individual, but when reading it, I was also reminded by his first presidential address, in which he's ending with, "Citizens, the government has returned to you." More than 2 decades later, we are not sure whether we want to keep the government with us or, you know, it did come back to us, but maybe it's just that weirdo that we would rather kick out or do something, change it altogether. So, those being said, I'd like to start from my right and give the floor to Ms. Rumyana, and I hope I'm going to pronounce right. Thank you.
I was expecting to speak with a second speaker, but anyway. I would like to start my presentation with two kind of remarks with regards to the notions that we use. We speak about transition generation, but within this period there was such an intensive change that I do think that this generational cohort is not, in fact, it's not, I think we could dramatically systematically divide this generation into two groups. I have this personal experience that gives me the basis to state this, but also I have my approach of a person that deals with comparative research, and I have quite a lot of evidences to think that this group consists of two separate and quite distinctive age groups. With the people born in the first decade, I had the experience not only observing that at least half of the ministers in the current Bulgarian government are from this generation, but for example, 2/3 or even 75% of the team of the former Bulgarian president were from this generation. He just selected them. Being too young, he selected them to be from this generation. So I don't think that this is a generation of people that are entering, or but this is a generation, this first decade, people who are born in this first decade, from 75 to 85, these are people who are already quite actively involved. They are already leaders, they are already kind of shaping our present. And of course, those that are born in the second decade, basically my son belongs to this group, of course to the and I think that they're just entering their professional experience. And I think this difference is not the difference of first 10 years and second 10 years. It's a difference of the way things have developed. So those that were born between 75 and 85, they very quickly matured. And they very quickly got involved due to specific political and social changes. And those that were born in the second decade, they were quite latecomers, also due to specific changes. So this is one remark with regard to the subject that we are discussing. And then I have the second remark, which of course everybody has in mind, that we are speaking about democratization, but I don't think that this has been the most essential change that we have witnessed, and especially this generation has witnessed, because I'm absolutely sure that mobile phone, smartphones, internet, new media, especially new media, makes a difference between this generation and our generation. And this is the first generation that basically uses all these tools and means very naturally, and has kind of grown up, especially in the second decade, or those that are born in the second decade. They grew up with all these new achievements. Of course, they're not born in a digital environment, but they definitely differ in their digital environment, in their attitude towards digital environment. So from that point of view, I think it's not a homogeneous group. It's not a homogeneous group. And we can discuss the distinction, the differences within the group. And I think that of course, generations are determined in sociology, that there is a kind of rule how we determine generations. But for this period, I think that the time has passed too quickly, so perhaps we might be speaking about two generations, not about one. Then when I have to kind of outline a common characteristic feature about this one or two generations, I know that transition is too wide and of course it's too complex. So I have chosen an aspect of what we have, of the stage we have lived through, which I think explains a lot of peculiarities, a lot of the experiences of these generations. And this aspect is called Europeanization. So we might speak about democratization, but from the first moment, from the very, very first day, of the political and social changes that have been started within the post-communist state or within Central and Eastern Europe, they have been Europeanization. Of course, from the first moment it was not about the European Union, but it was about the Council of Europe, and it was about the model of the regime. Nobody ever thought about any other model but parliamentary democracy. And of course, I think that when we have to examine the intrinsic mechanisms of what we have lived through, this is, of course, conditionality, but it is much more. We have passed, and this generation has passed through something that we call permissive consensus. The differences in the region could be explained to a large extent with what we call absorption capacity. And of course, when we think about the crisis that we are experiencing at the moment, we may explain the crisis both with the crisis within the European Union and with the crisis that characterizes these specific stages of change, of urbanization, which pass through mimicry or disguise, which is the first stage, then into imitation or simulation or copying, which is the second stage, and then there is this real crisis between the second stage and the third stage, which is alteration or substantial change. So I do think that we have still not reached alteration or substantial change, and we're experiencing a crisis which is very typical for this kind of gradual transformation which would be described. Of course, I have many things to talk, and we can discuss them. There is one last remark that I'm going to make. It's related to populism. You know, this period has been a period of dramatic and very quick political change, very short-lived political projects, which stimulate kind of protest reactions which are described with the broad notion of populism. But exactly because it was such an intensive change of political projects, replacement of political projects, we are witnessing a very, very shallow populism, which is of course more widespread than, for example, in Western Europe. So it's a very specific type of harmony which is combined with populism, political harmony which is combined with populism. And just to end with a remark to the keynote speaker, I definitely can find a difference in views. Because, you know, the Western view towards this generation is that this is going to be the first generation that is worse off than its parents. Definitely in Eastern Europe it's vice versa.
Thank you so much. I was actually thinking about obviously this first-personal, so to say, first-personal, point that I am going to take, the difference of perception when it comes to the Europeanization process versus what transition meant for so many of us from the region, and how difficult it was to accept that for many of us actually transition failed. But I will just, I will struggle hard not to be a contributor, and pass the microphone to Filip. We'll try to be on the right for once, and then come back to the left, Filip. What I probably forgot to mention, as I was extremely enthusiastic to start, I think that one of the strengths of this panel is the incredible mix of experiences. So you have people that are activists, and then there are political scientists, there are people that join think tanks, but as it is probably one of the features of our generation, I think that many of us wear multiple hats, and every now and then they go for a fashion statement and they wear them in the same time. Filip?
Should be fine now. Okay. So first of all, thank you very much for inviting me to the organizers. It's very, I would say, beautiful. The modern style, it's very, very, very interesting. So it's great to be here. So to be brief, for the beginning, I just wanted to tell you that I already admire and I'm happy of the orientation, the methodology that was taken by the authors of this report. I mean, I think that analyzing our situation through the experiences of different generations is very, very useful and very fruitful. And I would like to tell you just a few things related to that, based on my experiences and observations based on my research done in Poland, where I live and work in a Warsaw-based think tank. First of all, I have to say that this way of thinking also shows that we can observe that it's not only the legacy of the former communist times that have influenced our current situation, since it was quite a common way to explain the situation in the country, explaining why there is so low public social trust in our countries. Actually, it's the fact of all this region. Why people are not so publicly active, they are not volunteering. Why on the other hand, especially in case of Poland, why they are so, I would say, strongly oriented towards the nationalistic virtues as well, which is also the fact that Poles are rather traditionalist and they are quite strongly oriented towards national cultural values because of our difficult history. And I don't want to go to that because we don't have time. We can discuss it in the evening if one of you would like to discuss it with me. I will be there. Anyway, but then actually this was also the experiences that were that members of this generation of transition they grew with it. At least this first part of the generation, the oldest ones, definitely, they grew up at the end of the communism. They also grew up by parents who grew up and lived their lives in the communistic times. So definitely it influenced their behavior. But I'm moving a bit in the history. What we can see that also was very important and kind of created the behavior, the attitudes of this group of people as well, was the experience of actual transition and how it was implemented in our countries. Like when I again get back to Poland, to my country, definitely our transition was built basic or referring to the tradition of the Solidarity movement. We are all aware of this. What happened in the beginning of the 80s in Poland was really very massive movement with very high strong values of being together, of understanding others, of having a dialogue with other people, and so on and so forth. But apparently it was lost during the second half of the 80s, during the martial law, and when we entered the transition in 1989, it was done rather on the liberal individualistic model, with people being really focused on their individual careers, and also experiencing quite large political fights that were actually getting higher and higher when the time passed in the years, and this also influenced the attitudes to the public activities, to the public sphere, because what we could observe that the people were starting more and more declining from being active, from participating publicly, from taking part in the elections, and so on and so forth. So we ended up in the situation with half of the population didn't care at all about taking part in the elections, because the voting turnout normally in Poland is even less than 50%. And it brings me to the last point, about the new generation that actually was born. I mean, it also includes this youngest group of the generation of transition, but also people a bit younger that were already born in the 1990s, that actually grew up already after all this happened. So after they didn't experience the transition in the 1989, the transformation, all these economical difficulties, they grew up and they become publicly conscious in the beginning of the 2000s, the year 2000s, or around our country entering the European Union in 2004. And for them, actually, what we can see, there are two possible understanding, and I'm telling this based on the research that we have done. Actually, several research that we've done covering people aged 16 to 29, asking them about their ideas on democracy and attitudes to the public participation. And what we can see that, of course, they do not trust traditional politics at all, much more than the older people. But they are interested in democracy, and they are also interested in the quality of life and social policies. That's in very general way. So we can say that maybe from one side we can see that they actually only care even much more about the quality of life, and they do not care about what will happen to the state. So they are really very pragmatic and oriented on their own interests only. So what would be rather negative understanding of this the youngest group of our society. But there is also the other possibility that maybe they just are taking probably there are much more understanding as well, but we don't have time for that. So the other understanding would be that maybe they just take for granted democracy. They grew up in the democratic times society, and they just demand the higher quality of the policies to be implemented by our politicians, and they are looking for the politicians that will be really willing to step aside from this regular political fights and really deal with the people's needs and deliver concrete social policies that will make the life quality better. What would mean that especially this youngest part of and this is very last sentence of this generation of transition would be kind of the next level of the citizens, maybe, and maybe it's up to them actually to establish the ways how our societies will operate, maybe some new ideas how to make democracy work. I would like to, and I would prefer from the beginning to stick to this more positive version and picture and discuss it more.
Thank you, Filip, for zooming out. Actually, I think it is one of the biggest debates of the continent. This connection between justice and inequality, or whether we can talk about justice and democracy without strong social policy to support both of them. We stay in the area and we continue with our Lithuanian guests. And as it is my terrible duty to remind all of the panelists to try and stay within around 7 minutes. Thank you.
be shorter, quicker, I mean, for opening lines, to have even longer discussion afterwards. Is it better? So I work in the anti-corruption field, been doing that for more than 7 years now, and we try to understand and find how to work with different generations. And we see that working with them, you really need different patterns and you need different tools. For instance, for me it's very interesting what young people think in Lithuania, those who are still in schools. We did a representative survey and we asked about the values that are most important to them. And they listed 3 things: education, family, and honesty. And having those 3 things, then we measured what and how they behave in schools. And they cheat a lot, cheat a lot. And then it was so troubling when I said, oh, honesty is like top 3 priority for you. But 90% of them cheat occasionally, and they don't see any problem. The answers you would usually get is that once they graduate, once they enter university, they won't do this anymore. It's only for now. And when we do the same thing, when we measure the behavior and perceptions of students, we hear the same things. And then you understand that it's like quite a confusing perception that we have in the Baltic region maybe, and maybe beyond that. Because we had quite recently a conference with our Nordic colleagues and students were coming, and the topic of the panel and working groups was cheating. So for students from the Nordic countries, it was such a strange topic to talk about. Like, why would they talk about cheating in school? They just don't do that. So then you understand that we really have this heritage that comes and just takes place in new, like young people as well. And then we try to understand how to change this behavior, because we want people to be like concerned citizens. We want them to become part of civil society. But it doesn't happen naturally. You have to learn those things. So we are looking like how to engage them in schools. So we're offering participatory budgets, which is totally new thing, at least in Lithuania. And we see that it works like really, really well, and that we need to put a lot of effort to reprogram maybe people and how they start thinking differently. We also see that the scars that were left, they're particularly felt when it comes to trust. We don't trust in each other, we don't trust in the parliament, we don't trust in politicians and decision makers. We think that they're here to gain some prosperity for themselves, and they serve their own interests, and sometimes this is the case. But the perceptions are even higher. And the last big thing for the first talk is that I also think that very often we use this Soviet heritage as an excuse, and we hear that quite often on municipal level, on national level, from decision makers, from politicians. Why they do not start doing anything. Why, oh no, we're not used to all the Soviet past where the personalities formed during this period. It's sometimes a convenient conversation to have as well. So I'm also very interested in how to trigger change and not to get stick with this heritage that we have, and that it wouldn't influence our current decisions so largely.
Yes, I think it works. But whether not necessarily how to move on from our, so to say, our legacies, but whether there is something we take from them and we understand ourselves and our families that lived through communism, and in my case in Romania through but it seemed to be a never-ending transition, and then maybe we can find ways in addressing some of our challenges better, because it's obviously rather difficult to ask people to forgive their past. No? The past, there is a saying, the past never really passes. There is a saying in my country. And then if that is true, maybe we can keep it with us and try to understand ourselves better, so that there are actually ways in which we remain attached to values like equality or freedom. Equality and freedom, I hope I gave you a good opening. We were speaking a bit before the panel.
Does it? Yeah. My general message would actually start from really a big will to acknowledge the organizers of this conference in their thinking about the uniting our countries, the representatives of our countries together. Because from what I see in my very limited experience of going on to the conferences, we actually rarely meet together our regions. So I do acknowledge your decision. And the second is actually thinking about transition, the generation of transition. And I actually want to refer to the first speaker who said that they are already sort of decision makers. They are already at positions to decide, at positions. Yes, I do agree with you, and I think that's why our talk becomes even more important, because this is an everyday decision making by these people. I would actually add up your idea about splitting up this generation for two is not that relevant to my country, because two other obvious or not obvious reasons, we all actually experience pretty much the same. The only thing which really differs this generation, like parts of generation in my country, is that I would agree with the keynote speaker that people who were born in 1975 till 1985, they did experience better economic situation in 2000s before the world crisis. Those people who graduated after 2010, and these are people who were born after 85, they did experience something else. So this is the only thing which can divide this generation of transition. But generally, I agree with the organizers that this is a very important generation to speak about. I will speak about from the perspective of Ukraine, and from the perspective of Ukraine, I need to actually challenge the words from the name of the panel. It's a backsliding of democracy, because in my country we don't see it. It doesn't mean that it is good news. It means that the path of democracy in our country is very complex, and it didn't end. And it's referring to other speaker about did transition fail? Well, it didn't, because it never ended. And to be honest, I think I'm not an expert in all your countries separately, but I think that transition never ended to none of us. And we should remember this and keep in mind. In terms of the generation of transition in Ukraine, this is the generation who made two revolutions. The first revolution was, if you remember, the Orange Revolution, and the second was the revolution which is also called Euromaidan, or the Revolution of Dignity. And it actually refers to your report when you wrote about that economic situation and economic well-being is very important to this generation, but it also touches their dignity. And they see their dignity through the economic perspective. We are happy and lucky in Ukraine, but again, not because this is nice news, but because of complexity of the news. In 2010 till 13, we actually saw that you can have problems with your dignity, having a really bad political situation in the country. And you can touch with your hands, and you can understand with your mind that democracy is really important. And that's what you talked about, the populism, and if we forget about the importance of liberal democracy. When in Ukraine, like, as a matter of fact, not as a matter of our, our efforts in 2013, but as a matter of fact, we saw that it is important. Our economic situation and well-being is dependent on political situation. And that's what actually made people go out to the streets. So what we have now, after we actually celebrate or commemorate or something in between the 5th anniversary of the Revolution of Dignity in our country yesterday and today. So what we have after this 5 years period, we actually started fighting for our democracy literally only in 2013. The first 22 years of, the experience of independence was actually preparation for that. Understanding, finding our identity, trying to understand our identity, including starting from the economic perception to the, the political preferences. We also started in a real world, like really started fighting corruption. And that's why the Transparency International Ukraine is one of the most important and most, like, the biggest organizations now in Ukraine, having around up to 50 people working there. So what, to conclude about the generation of transition, it is relevant name for Ukrainian people who live there, definitely. It is important to research them because they are those people who make decisions, including those who were born in 1992. However, it is still unusual for us to understand that somebody who was born after the collapse of Soviet Union, is somebody to make a decision about the policies in your country. It is strange, and they are still very young. But as a matter of fact, our country proves that these people sometimes, having no experience, sometimes are still better at these positions. They're not very good news for senior generations. But the challenge for Ukraine is now to combine the experience, like the wisdom we call it, from senior generations, but still limit their corruption practices, their own understanding of the world, and use this new, sometimes romantic view of Ukraine. This is a challenge. And I will end up with the citation of one of the Ukrainian historians from Lviv University, Yaroslav Grytsak. He always mentions that values, liberty, freedom, things which you fight, soon or later need to be spread on bread. What does it mean? That it is important, and Ukrainians have proved, in my side, from our side, that they can fight. It is important. Democracy is important, even though we hadn't think about it in 2005, for example. It is important. We do understand it. But we also understand, like, if it comes to the talk about policies, social policies, economic policies, sooner or later, this freedom, equality, liberal values in general, should lead to better well-being.
Thank you. We continue with the historians. Probably with I want with my bet that we will have more metaphors regarding bread, because it can be too politically heavy.
Thank you very much. Always, it's very about I'm always happy to talk after a representative of Ukraine because we all follow the events in Ukraine. At least I think that all of us follow them. And at least me, I was full of respect to the people who decided to defend exactly the democracy and their rights. And that's a very good lesson that we can learn, and I think we forgot this lesson. That democracy is something that we have to fight for. We knew this lesson very well in the 90s, but now it seems that partially in our part of the world, in Central and Eastern Europe, we forgot it, at least to some extent. Talking about generation, I was thinking that maybe I had to start with a small presentation of mine. I was born in 1969, so in 1989 I was 20 years old. So in the whole this period of 30 years, I have spent quite a lot of time on the streets of Sofia, marching and protesting and attacking governments. So that's part of my biography to demonstrate, to be street active, to some extent, of course, anonymously active. But since I'm here invited to talk to you as a historian, we historians, I must confess, we are slightly suspicious of numbers, percentages, all those things that are so fashionable today. We tend to think, or we are trying to think more in processes. And from historical point of view, talking about generations, I think generations of transition, I think there is only one relevant difference between generation. This is the generation that representatives or people who lost from transition and people who benefited from transition. It's clear that my parents, for example, they were among those who lost from transition economically. And it's clear, although in the 90s I thought that I'm part of a lost generation, now I'm sure that I'm a representative of a generation that benefited from transition. This makes me think, talking about the title of the discussion, whether the democracy is backsliding today in our countries, I would say that yes, I agree that it's backsliding. There is a crisis of democracy in our countries, at least in Central and Eastern Europe, I think so. But what's the reason for that? And the reason to me is, and how to say, I think that's what worries me actually is maybe the more relevant question. The first thing that I'm getting really afraid of is that the main achievement of the revolution from the 90s is completely forgotten. The main achievement to me, it was the peaceful character of those transitions. We didn't go into civil wars or ethnic wars, what happened in former Yugoslavia. We succeeded to keep this transition peaceful. And today, some people are trying to tell us that this is exactly the problem of the transition. That there were some people who concluded a deal, meaning old communist elite concluded a deal with the first generation of liberal Democrats, and there was a conspiracy. This is the very, very widespread conspiracy theory. For example, last month I was in a conference at a conference in Poland. The conference was about John Paul II, and for today's conference, no one even mentioned the name of Lech Walesa. It was something completely ununderstandable to me. What I mean is that the leaders of this generation, the leaders of those revolutions, they are not only forgotten, they are even worse. There are certain people who are trying to reject their legacy, and that's really something that really strikes me and makes me afraid. But still, where the strength of those, if we can call them soft autocrats, soft dictators or soft autocrats, comes from? Why the democracy is backsliding? I think their main message is stability. They're saying we promise you stability. And this message is very appealing for a generation that has spent time through so many problems, economic problems, political problems, uncertainties. Stability is a really, really appealing message. But that's also, I think, it's their problem. It's their problem because when they're talking about stability, what they're saying finally is that they are sealing, if I can say so, sealing the transition. They're trying to say that the game is over. They're trying to say that whoever got rich, he will remain rich, and whoever remained poor, he will remain poor. And I think this generates a huge tension within the society, and I think that exactly this stability that they're thinking is their strength actually is the source of their downfall. So from historical point of view, I'm thinking that yes, the democracy in our countries is backsliding, it's true, but still I think it's more of a stage, it's more a step toward real democracy. If you want, it's part of the transition, although the transition is not the word that is very politically correct in our countries anymore. Thank you.
Thank you as well. Actually invite, there are other people that already want to contribute to our conversation. I'm sure there must be. Please, join us.
So, I'm going to be the first. Because I have a question. I'm a representative of the Generation Z. And there are some others than me in this room. And I'm worried about one thing. You know, that generation of transition which we're talking about, there are now grown-up parents and they are raising kids, right? And there is something like common nostalgia toward the communism, because, you know, in Bulgaria specifically, as Momchil said, the democracy is backsliding. And those people were young during communism's last breath, if I can say metaphorically. And, you know, they were happy, they were young. Everything seemed fine, everything seemed cool, and now when they're parents, they're trying to convince their kids, which are tomorrow's leaders, that during that kind of political authorities, that kind of publicity is better than democracy, and you know, can you give me a solution to that problem? How can we prevent those kids from believing what their parents say to them actually? Because, you know, it's hard to think in a different way when you're raised to think in something like that from a little kid, and everyone around you is just telling, oh, democracy is it's not good, it only ruins the country and something like that.
I think that's something that pretty much follows up some ideas you already mentioned, the struggle between the stability of whether soft or hard authoritarian regime and what it seems to be our never-ending engagement with making sure that democratic processes do actually matter. And we all know there is no democracy without Democrats, you know, there is as much as democracy as you make and all these nice slogans, but then at the end of the day, some of us, after protesting and protesting and protesting, maybe would like actually to have some time to cool off maybe, and then whether we are, I mean, some of us are not parents, but do teach, and it is to follow up on and extend a bit your question. It is also interesting to relate to students that are also very tempted to look at the days before 1989 in a very nostalgic manner, and their information comes from various unexpected places on internet. So there are all these websites that are talking about our glorious and amazing, prosperous communist past, of which I am not aware of. So it's a very interesting situation. If someone wants to pick up on.
I don't think that democracy is really questioned. I think that the liberal character of democracy is questioned by these people. They speak about illiberal democracy. And of course, as I mentioned, democratization was to a large extent Europeanization in our country. So, of course, Europeanization is questioned. So if there is a nostalgia, it's not exactly a nostalgia, of course. There are some people who are nostalgic about communism, but mostly nostalgia, it has this anti-liberal and Eurosceptic disguise. So this is really the way it's okay. And I looked through the attitudes of this transition generation, and I don't think that the majority of them has this nostalgia. So perhaps you're referring to a previous generation. These guys which are born after 1975, from statistical data, I don't think that they're nostalgic.
I'll be on a philosophical side, and it's maybe very pessimistic. But again, the way to democracy, the path to democracy, is long. And recalling the economic theory, you remember the economic development goes like that. There's ups and downs, but generally, the economist hopes for general going up. So maybe you are in your countries, or in your country, or those people are somewhere in the down, but generally in the up. So I hope for that, for you. But I have a few very practical recipes for that. You still have illiberal regimes in the world. Refer to them, how people live there. I don't want to call the names, but let's have a look, right? Do they live nice? And the second one about what I would like to, open the discussion about, and just remind all of us, these narratives come from somewhere, either from nostalgia, for it's a very common thing for senior generations to think that the youth is better. The bread was better, the air was better. It's Leo Tolstoy who wrote it 200 years ago about that, or 150 years ago about it. That it's usually when your youth was better. Was it communism or not? So we should recall this. And the most critical thing, which I also think, it's about the framing the narratives about our past from the Russian propaganda. For in our country, the mainstream narrative is that the state has failed. It doesn't give you anything, so and it's sort of deteriorates the identity as a citizen of Ukraine. In your regions, in each single area, in each single country, there is another narrative which is being invested. A lot of money are invested in each narrative, so we should also research more. Where does this narrative comes from? I think it's not only from nostalgia. And if you say that it's not only senior generations, but actually the generation of transition, maybe this narrative is being formed by somebody, and it should be explored better.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. I feel very honored because I'm a Western voice in this mostly Eastern European realm at the moment. A few remarks, and please stop me if I'm getting too long. First, if this is a consolation for you, I think cheating pupils and cheating students are not an exclusively Eastern European phenomenon. We have them in Germany too, and we have had them, if I remember my own school time, for ages.
I think they should be cheating.
They should be cheating. The question is whether they become cheating and corrupt grown-ups. We are not talking about German adults who are happy if they can somehow evade some taxes. I'm not going to deep into detail. We had the call for more civic education, if I interpreted it correctly. And this reminds me of an interesting article I read in local and regional newspapers in Germany only at the beginning of this month. You know that Germany has these regional parliaments because of the federal structure of Germany. We have the Länder. And we have a phenomenon which brings teachers and parents to desperation sometimes, the phenomenon of Kulturhoheit der Länder. Yes, Stefan is smiling. For several and also historical reasons, the different Länder in Germany are relatively free within a given framework to determine education, how pupils are taught, what they are taught. Yes, there is a special framework, but it's not easy for a northern German child, for example, to move to Bavaria and follow school times there. Anyway, we have this Kulturhoheit, and once a year the cultural ministers of the German Länder meet. And this year they had their annual conference, well, they meet more often, but this year they had the annual conference at the beginning of November. And among other things, they demanded that there was given more relevance to civic education in German, all over Germany. And they even demanded that civic engagement of pupils in their leisure time was remarked or was made a comment, was commented about in the certificates. So if a pupil is civically engaged in their leisure time, then this should be openly made mention of in their school certificates, just to show, not to show off, but to show that pupils are engaged. I found this very interesting, and I found this even more interesting because I read about it only in some regional newspapers, not in the big newspapers and not in the big media. Democracy backsliding, especially in former communist countries. Who would have thought 5 years ago that in Germany we would see a right-wing, xenophobic, nationalist, anti-European party, not only in many of the Landtage, in the regional parliaments, but also with a 12.9% share in the Bundestag. Which brings me to Europe, and your remark about democratization in Central and Eastern Europe was in the first place, or not only but also was Europeanization. And I think this brings us to democracy not yet backsliding, but getting a nastier turn in Western European countries. Germany is not the only country, but we have other countries with a not too democratic, but democratically elected, and definitely anti-European government. Sorry, Germany does not have an anti-European government, but an anti-European party in the Bundestag. Which brings me to the EP elections next year. And you've mentioned Putin, somebody has mentioned Russia, and I think it was you, Russian propaganda. If we look further west, and I mean, if we move long enough towards the east, then we end up traveling long enough, then we also end up in the west, in the US. You probably have heard that one of Donald Trump's biggest allies is now organizing the previously non-organized anti-European forces in different European countries to help and support them, and definitely financially, and definitely also with the right tools and instruments to unite in order to get an anti-European a decisive anti-European force in the European Parliament. And if we take this into consideration, then democratization or democracy is at stake all over Europe. Thank you.
Thank you. And
just a very maybe short remark. Really interesting example with certificates. Thank you for sharing. It will be useful for me when coming back. About cheating, just short notice. Probably in many countries people cheat. It depends whether it's done systematically or not. And when done systematically, there are quite a few researchers long-term showing that systematic cheating in school, then at university leads to corrupt practices in the working places and etc. So having, I think, a significant problem of corruption in the region and seeing how it correlates with practices that we're used to when we're young, it's quite alarming, and that's the reason why it makes me concerned and trying to understand how to reduce that.
Okay, so maybe very briefly, just maybe very briefly also coming back to the previous question, because I believe that we also have a problem with like transformation of this experience of democracy, and that's why also young people can feel sometimes lost and not understanding a bit what's going on and so on and so forth. This is also due to the fact that their parents were busy with other things during the 90s, and I know that I'm simplifying and generalizing very much, but I'm doing this for the matter of this discussion. But anyway, on the other hand, since I'm normally more on this negative side, just claiming that how many problems we have, and we have them, and we do agree that we have great problems, and I agree that they are not only in this part of Europe, but actually in other parts of the continent and even outside the continent as well. I'm mentioning countries like Brazil, that was to be a few years ago, it was to be like the main example of the good democracy, but we all know what happened there lastly. Anyway, what I wanted to say that is that there are maybe still some hopes that maybe even though all these problems we are observing, all the problems with our current politicians and with our economies, our countries, maybe we can see that we have reached quite a lot in our countries. We have reached some democratic rights that are to some extent working, and we have also reached that this democratic values have to some certain level reached also to especially the younger people, to the younger generation as well, since they really recognize, at least it is true in Poland, democracy is a very important system, and actually the best system of governing in the country, and they are just criticizing the current state of our democracies, the current politicians, what they are doing, how they are behaving, and they are claiming them to change, or maybe they will become the politicians themselves. So maybe there are still some hopes. I know there are very many problems because I'm searching them as well. So please don't take me with my tongue. But I would like to bring also some positive sides to our discussion.
One word with regard to cheating. So I mean, cheating, because I worked and I thought about education a lot, and there are two aspects of cheating at school. The first one is that it's very common in new democracies where free riding is not really kind of understood as something that erodes public space. So I think this is the first thing that we can observe everywhere. It's not only at school, but you can see cheating everywhere. I remember there was a time when in public transport nobody paid a ticket in Sofia public transport because everybody thought, okay, I can free ride here, and it's cheap. But the second thing, and it's the worst thing in our schools about cheating, is that it is a distrust in meritocratic approach. So So you cheat because you don't need to know. In order to achieve your life goal. So it's the worst type of cheating. So from that point of view, of course, cheating is a common phenomenon everywhere at school. But the truth is that, for example, in Bulgaria, the winning strategy for a certain period of time was considered to be cheating. Now, at life, during life, you win if you cheat. So there is a specific term, which is from Turkish origin, tarikat. So everybody who is tarikat, it's a winning strategy to be a And then you have this second, a much deeper problem, the distrust in meritocratic approach. So you don't need to know, you don't need to achieve anything. It's just a matter of, I don't know what, connections or anything like that. So, and from my point of view, it's the worst thing for democracy.
Very well, but the whole attack against democracy, it is a good example, or it's a proof of the historical truth that a big social change, because that's exactly what happened in our countries, is followed by a conservative reaction. And this lesson is valid even when this social change obviously is positive. Because all indicators, especially at least in our countries that became European Union members, are much better in any respect, economy, criminality, everything. They're much better if we compare those standards with the period of the communism. Stable, monolithic. What I know for sure is that dictators can look very stable, very strong, very monolithic, but finally they are much more vulnerable than the democracies. And I must say that I believe in the stability, the stability of democracy in the broader sense. And just as an anecdote, I can give you an example from Bulgarian political landscape. The Bulgarian anti-European forces, they like very much to attack European Union, but when it comes to European elections, now they're having a big battle how to run, on which ticket to run for the European elections, because they will place only one MP there, and they will be split into 3 probably, just because they want very much this single place.
Thank you. Before we are trying, please.
Yes.
I just want to make a personal disclosure. As we are speaking, my students are taking the midterm exam in political theory, so I'm not encouraging cheating at any moment, but speaking of solutions, I decided to take a leap of trust and let them have a takeaway exam and write an essay on whatever they feel like. So I hope that it pretty much solves the idea of cheating at test. Please.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you. My name is Enzio Wetzler. I'm here at the Goethe Institute's director, so the local German Cultural Institute. And actually we are somewhat busy also in this field of how to deal with the past. A little bit at least. And I think nobody staying here, especially coming from Germany, is free from this task to deal with it. And what I really appreciate here is this perspective into the widening the borders of these discussions in two directions. One is this regional aspect, so coming from Lithuania, Romania, Ukraine, Bulgaria. This is really a very big advantage that every country is fighting with its own, inside its own borders, and also inside its own, how you say, cultural elite somewhat, because there are so many parallelities. I really appreciate this perspective. And the other is the talk about the generations, because I was raised not in communist but in capitalistic times, so the Western Federal German Republic, and we always had to decide whether we believe in communism or in socialism, or maybe the get ahead German Democratic Republic is not the best, the real communist, but could become, or if we are with the more Western style or American way of life. So I think that this Antigone is somewhat to its end, and the question about cheating, I would say it's also something in the normal, very traditional Western European countries as well. So the democracy, it's on a challenge throughout Europe, not only in the post-Soviet states. But the thing what I'm somewhat missing here is you cannot imagine the scenery here. I would say the audience is maybe an average of 35 or maybe 40. In those events, the German political foundations, for example, the more right-oriented wing from Angela Merkel's party, Konrad Adenauer Foundation, for example, if they have such an event, the average of the audience is about 80 or maybe 75. It's a real big difference. And it would be the question how to unite the experience of that generation X or Y or Z and A, B, C. Because like this, every generation feels somewhat lost in its own cohort, we call it, in group. But thanks a lot for this new perspective.
Thank you. Thank you as well for your comments. As we are, there is please. We are. No, please join us. I think that would be sticking to yes. And we acknowledge also another participant, and then we will get we will be slowly wrapping up as we are approaching the time. Please.
Thank you very much. I'm Polina Rogowska from Ukraine. Nice to meet you as well. So I support your ideas about everything, but I just would like to comment on part of our discussion. It is cheating, yes? So I regard it in a wider perspective, because we are not talking about teaching, just habit. We are talking about democratic, maybe learning about democracy and living in democratic standards. It's two different things to live in democracy and to study democracy, yes, to learn about democracy. So Ukraine and Eastern Partnership, yes, countries who are not EU members, so they just learn about democracy to some extent if they have such maybe such place in their curriculum. So I would like to tell or to just stress a very important issue here in our discussion, maybe a bit missing. It's civic education importance, because the generation before, all the generation or generation in transition, they didn't experience to learn about democracy even. They learned occasionally, to some extent, more or less, but the life is different from even learning process, because existing of democratic institution doesn't give proof for existing of democracy in life. So teaching is a part of culture of democracy. If it is, I agree, it is systematically we experience in democracy like in Germany, and we have standards, EU standards, like we live in Bulgaria. But we know that we live according to some European standards. And we live in Ukraine and other countries experienced in communism, when all generation experienced in other, even standards, double standards, yes, in life. So it's really make a difference. That's why I'd like to underline the issue of civic education is very important. As to Ukraine, I'd like to say that I'm dealing with civic education last 20 years. So it's a really deal of my life, of my personal experience, and now I would say that really after Revolution of Dignity we have good progress in this issue. We have compulsory subject in our curriculum, and I am one of the authors of one of textbook in civic education, but also we experience in civic education in out-of-school activities and in many activities of youth. And I would like that you mentioned that you are Generation Z representative, no?
It's a person who actually
sorry, yes. Okay. But I would like to say that the result of civic education developing of 20 years in Ukraine, it's really young generation who stood against corruption, stood against totalitarian features in Ukrainian political system in 2013 and 14. So it's very important. In spite of lack of civic education, in spite of lack of experience, really life experience, we have generation who has own opinion, who can struggle, not having some experience in democratic institutions, who can struggle for freedom, for European and really very important democratic values. So now I see, after listening attentively all of your comments, I see that Ukraine has very good, optimistically minded direction and dynamic of development. And it's very important that all of Europe could have the same dynamic and very good message for Ukrainian youth to continue this democratic direction in their development. Thank you.
Thank you. Just one final, I'm sorry, I think this is very back.
I can just turn it this one.
Okay. Thank you very much. I'll be very short. I'll just listening very carefully your opening words and the discussion and the comments afterwards. And I was thinking, my reflection went on to how different, according to me, are the tasks the different generations in transition generation in the different countries are facing. Like, for example, our colleague from Germany shared this news that in Germany the students would be asked to have certificates because they not yet, but but this is the demand. Okay, this is in discussion. And here in Bulgaria, we are still in a moment of training teachers who will teach in 2020 civic education in Bulgarian school. So civic education will be officially introduced as a subject, not horizontally taught in other subjects, but as a subject civic education in 2020, only in 11th and 12th grade, when the young people are already 11 or 19 years old, which means that they will vote. So this is one difference I just faced after listening to your comments. Second one that came to my mind is the difference between the generations facing the recent history, let's say in countries which belong to EU before the enlargement started, like Austria and Germany, for example. Last week I was in Austria, and by coincidence very nearby to Mauthausen, where the biggest concentration camp in Austria, in Upper Austria is, and the whole system of concentration camps there. And I faced, and I was told by local people there who are very much involved in observing the history, that recently, last 10 years, Austria started to tell the story of these camps. And I saw myself buses with young people who were there and told the story of this camp. So this story that, for instance, Germany is facing immediately after the Second World War, and many generations grew up with
discussing this wound and what happened with the Jewish people, etc. It's just new in Austria. So this is nowadays generation, young generations that are starting to face again something that happened in the Greek authorities.
Thank you so much. I think that besides having this challenging mind, that is probably one of democracy's biggest questions, who's guarding the guardians. I think it's equally important to what you said, also to know who's actually teaching, maybe if there is not a better word, civic education. Because, for example, in Romania, my department recently published a study on the attitudes towards democracy and equality of teachers, especially those in social sciences. And for those of you working in research, the research had more than 20,000 views, which for a research paper is something quite remarkable. However, it showed up a bit of a gloomy picture, because many teachers in high schools in my countries seem less attached to values like equality and freedom than the general population. And usually these are the teachers that are asked to perform, to teach civic education or something close to civic education. So that would probably, so to say, even make the equation even more complicated. Last one.
My name is Kayane, I'm coming from Armenia. And I wanted to reflect briefly, because I heard these 2-3 things that were repeated today, and of course that's a theme: generation, civic education, and democracy. I start from the last because I heard here that some countries there's a tendency to develop the civic education to make it into a subject at school or a compulsory subject. I don't believe that anywhere where there is better developed democracies, they have achieved this because the schools have taught civic education. It's all about rules of game. We should be thinking as a generation older than the generation Z, and we are I'm working in a civil society organization where we are helping to create environment and conditions. So when it comes to schools, it's the same is about cheating. The environment and the systems create incentives for cheating. And that environment may be in the homes with the parents, because you'll be punished if you take a B or a C to school, from school. So you will be cheating not to get a B or a C, because there is a punishment everywhere, and so you try to avoid the punishment. Now, the schools and the systems and the environment are very important, and we should be thinking in our programs, in our strategies, about creating environments for civic education to boost, but not to create a compulsory subject where the civic education should be taught. Because there's millions of questions: who will be teaching? What will they be teaching? How will civic education, after all, is nothing but freedom. It's the freedom to do what I want, and if there is a place to go, to volunteer, to help someone, to understand my rights, to practice my rights, that is about civic education. It's nothing more. Sharing my sandwich with someone who's hungry, that is a civic education. How do you limit civic education? Where to start from and where to end? End in jail or end in the becoming a member of a parliament? These boundaries are not set, and I'm very worried that while talking about this, we're trying to write everything into some crystallized boundaries. The same is about democracy. You know, do we have any boundaries about, we do know what the ingredients of democracy are, and they may have different reflection in every country. So I'm very much worried that we are trying to standardize these ingredients. They absolutely have different reflections. I'll give you a small example about the Soviet past that is happening today in Armenia. And this reflects to also your remark about children and parents issues and the generational trends. One of the things that was happening in that took place during the Soviet Union was that many multiple ethnicities of different religions lived together, although they shared some painful conflicts. After the breakup of the system, we appeared in a situation of real war, where people were killed. And this generation Z that is present in Armenia today does not absolutely understand how could the people with whom we are in war have lived together. But there has been something positive. So we should cherish the positive experiences and turn them into tools of overcoming barriers today as well. This is one thing. The second thing I will finalize is that when we're speaking about East or West, it's not a one-way street of teaching. It's not the West that is teaching the East and has a lot to teach. It's also the East that has a lot to offer to the West. And to give you one example of the Friday nights in any Western big city, you'll see a lot of drunk young people in the streets. More east in Armenia, you won't see it. You will see a lot of movie theaters, you will see a lot of clubs where there's young people, but you won't see them having violent fun, so-called. So we should always keep in mind, when we are thinking about generational change and generational strength, it always should be a two-way. And the mobility of the young people is key for providing these two-way processes. So
thank you so much. Thank you for your input. This is why it's cool to attend Sofia platform events, because people help you with the conclusions. So no need for me to say something else besides thanking my colleagues and thanking you for your patience.
Thank you, Mădălina, for then join me in maybe thanking the panel first. So thank you very much.